Welcome to Driftwood Lane. Inspired by weathered coastal paths and sun-bleached wood, it's clean, airy, and modern, but still built on classic quilt design. If you're curious about modern quilting, but aren't ready to go full-on radical, modern traditional quilting offers the perfect bridge. I'm Valerie Dawn from Quilt with Val, and I'll show you these blocks step by step. They're easier than they look. Let's get started. These are the fabrics I've chosen for Driftwood Lane. This is a lovely Moda Grunge frosted pink. This one is a lovely floral I picked up at a nice little fabric shop. And then I have three of these lovely soft blues. This is another Moda Grunge. And then I just have this nice neutral that blends beautifully with the floral. I'm also using these basic quilting tools. I have a small mat, my cutting rulers. I just put a nice sharp blade in my cutter. I use a regular pencil and of course my seam ripper and scissors. This is the first block we're going to start with. This is called a bear paw. Now the traditional bear paw, this area would be a solid color. This is modified. It has half square triangles. It's got a lot of half square triangles in these blocks, which is why I chose it, so I could use up my half square triangles. If you saw my Frosted Petals tutorial, you'll remember I suggested saving those half square triangle trimmings for another project. Don't worry if you didn't make Frosted Petals, it's fine. I'm going to show you how to make half square triangles in large batches. It's a fun technique. I had left over though from Frosted Petals many of these. I had enough for this whole quilt. I had almost enough of the blue and frosted pink, and I had to make a few more of those. And then to finish off the bear paw, I also made some with the blue and a nice soft blue for this half square triangle on the edge. To make the half square triangles, you can use the traditional method and just cut all the triangles, place them right sides together, and then stitch the diagonal line and just chain piece them. I don't use that method. It has some problems with it because as you stitch, that diagonal stretches, and then as you press it can stretch more. So you're faced with trimming up dozens of half square triangles to make sure they're perfectly square. With my method, stitching the half square triangles all in a block, the block of fabric stabilizes the diagonal so it doesn't stretch. And then if you've measured exactly the same as the template, your half square triangles will be the exact size you need for the quilt, and you won't have to trim them. You just have to be careful when you're pressing not to stretch. So you press down, you don't drag the iron across the diagonal. It saves a heap of time, and it's so much more efficient. For the bear paw block, we need 16 of the half square triangles that are blue and floral. I had all of those left over from Frosted Petals, but you can make them from scratch. And then we need 8 blue and the frosted pink. We need 4 of the blue and light blue, and we need 1 of these patches, and we need 4 white. This is double layers. There's 2 and 4. Now let's start making half square triangles. First, cut 2 pieces of fabric, the colors that you want for the half square triangles, the same size. Place them right sides together, and then you draw a grid. These horizontal and vertical lines are cutting lines. These are all squares measured the same distance. I just use a regular pencil to do this. I made a little mistake there when I was measuring. I just drew the next line or the line beside it so that these are all perfectly square. I didn't want to have to trim them down after I had these all cut. You have to be true to size about the measuring and stitching and cutting and pressing so that you don't stretch them. And that's just because I wanted to cut down on the amount of work. Sometimes I'll make them oversized so that I can trim them down perfectly. I didn't want to do that this time. I like to use the technique where I have a bit of selvage around the outside. I can trim these perfectly. And then I just use my ruler to draw diagonal lines through each of the intersections. Then I draw a 1/4 inch on each side. That 1/4 inch on each side is the stitching line. So I'm going to stitch on each side of this, and then I'm going to press it all flat, and I will then cut down this. I'll cut on all the vertical and horizontal lines, so I cut out all the squares, and then I will cut the diagonal lines. This grid is 5 by 4. That's 20 squares. That will give me 40 half square triangles. I only need 36 of these, but that's the closest that works out. So I'll have a few extra. I'll just set them aside. Maybe I'll make a wall hanging or something. And then I'm just going to get started stitching. Start at one corner on the stitching line. You only stitch on the diagonal lines, those two on either side of that diagonal cutting line. And just start. If you have a 1/4 inch foot, you don't necessarily have to draw these two lines. Just use your foot to measure a 1/4 of an inch. That's a little bit of a shortcut. Then just turn it around. Start where the cutting line is. We don't need to stitch over that point at the end. Just turn the whole piece around. I don't bother cutting threads. I'll do that later. And start on the next line. Just work your way back and forth all of these stitching lines until you're done. So once I get all of the diagonal lines stitched, and you can see I've hopped over those little tips, I spread out these threads so that when I trim the edge, I get rid of all that debris. And just go around all four edges. And now I'm just going to start cutting on these lines. Line them up really carefully, and then we're going to cut those 4 squares apart. There's 4 layers of fabric there. I just cut the diagonal. And that gives us ready to use half square triangles. Just press them carefully so you don't stretch that diagonal, and then snip the dog ears off and you're ready to use these half square triangles. For the bear paw block, there's 4 corners that are just exactly like this one. So I like to stack up my patches and stitch them all at the same time. So these are all 4 layers deep. And I just start stitching this pair and this pair and this pair, and stitch these blocks on so that I have them all chain pieced, and it goes a little faster. And then I can take them all to the iron at the same time and press them. I'm going to just place those together, make sure you get the right side edge stitched, and a 1/4 inch seam. I like to stitch with the white one facing me. There's no seams. The seam's on the bottom, and I'll just hop over that. And just chain piece. Now I've got them all opened up, snipped apart, lay them out again, and we'll stitch these seams together. And then I'll get out the iron and press them. I just need to show you a little boo-boo I made, where when I stitched this, I had this reversed, and I stitched them all wrong, and I had to pick them out. Just a word to pay attention to the proper placement before you sew, because once you get going with chain piecing, you might not notice your mistake. Okay, I'm just going to stitch these over, and then we'll press. Right, now that I recovered from my boo-boo, I will show you the pressing direction. So for the top row, I'm going to press them both seams out toward the outside patches. And for the middle row, I'm going to press them toward the inside. And the bottom row, you guessed it, I'm going to press toward the outside again. And you'll see what happens is these seams will nest together nicely. There we go. Then we just stitch each row together, top and bottom, and we do another little press. That was quick to stitch. I like to give a little press here, and I'm going to press them to the outside just to spread a little bit of that bulk to the outside rows. That one's already pressed inside. But on these rows, it's not that important because we have a sash that goes around this, and it won't matter. There won't be any seams that need to be nested. Nip that off. Let's turn it around. And I know that edge was straight, so I'm going to line it up along one of my grids. And I see I've got my 1/4 inch here. And then this one is a bit high, so I'm just going to do the same thing. Best to do this with a nice sharp blade. And then the next, that's a little bit crooked, but that's okay. I'm going to line this up against the grid lines here where I've already trimmed these two. And as I said, that's a 1/4 inch. So this patch is a bit high. I'm just going to trim that off. Now, we want to make sure at the same time that we still keep our 1/4 inch seams. And I see I've only got 1/8 of an inch there. Now, to be really conscientious, if I don't want to bury that point, I need to pick that seam out, nip this diagonal seam in just a bit, and then stitch it back together. Depends on your mood, what you're going to use the quilt for. If it's going to go in a show, you would definitely want to do that. The judges notice. And this one I'm just going to nip off. Okay, let me line that up again on the square and get 1/4 of an inch. I don't want to cut them too short. I'm a little bit narrow here on this one. It doesn't come out, it's like a 1/16 of an inch off. When I sew the sash on, I'll compensate for that, so it stitches straight across. I decided to fix my varied points. It's entirely up to you. If you're thinking of entering your quilt in a judged show, I recommend that you fix them because the judges will notice. Ask me how I know. And so I've finished all 4. I'm going to place them so that the bare paw points are facing out on each one of the corners. And then I have a narrow, this is just a 1-inch sash with this tiny little cornerstone in the center, which matches the cornerstone, the corner block patch in the bear paws. And I've made these the floral so that it pulls this whole block together and just unifies the main part of the block. So all I need to do now is just stitch these. Now, I rescued these strips from the Frosted Petals quilt. They were part of the border around the outside of the quilt. And I was able to reuse those scraps that I had cut off the 2 ends for my strips. Mind you, now you don't have to make the Frosted Petals quilt to do this one. You can certainly just cut these 1-inch strips for your sashing. Now all I'm going to do is stitch these. So I have the center sash, and I press it toward the floral, and then I stitch the top row with this sash in between and the bottom row, and then I will stitch all 3 together. And here's another tip when you sew the sash on. Remember when we trimmed them, we had the odd inside half square triangle that didn't quite make the measure. So you don't want to just pin this because that'll continue that error throughout the whole block. Lay it against the cutting board so that you have it straight along the edge. Put them right sides together and line the sash up with the cutting board line, not the patch. And then just put a little pin. And so when you stitch it, you'll have it straight and you'll fix that error. Now, yes, it makes that seam a little bit narrower, but there's still lots of threads there. That'll be a strong seam. I've put the sash between the two bear paws on the top and bottom. Just make sure that you have the points of the bear paws pointing toward the four corners. And all I need to do now is stitch the sash in between. This little cornerstone is pressed out, and these are both pressed toward the sash. Just a little close up before I stitch this. I've lined that up along my mat. That one's a little low, but I just pin it along so that I make up for that little shortfall. There it is, finished. One last little press. This sash again was pressed toward the sash, and we have our bear paw block finished. We're ready to move on to the accent block, which is an Ohio star with a lovely floral sash around it. This is the Ohio star block we're making, and it's a very straightforward block. We have 4 quarter square triangles. I'm going to show you a fun technique to do this. And then we just have these 4 white patches and the one frosted blue in the center. Once we stitch all that together, it's just a nice sash around the outside. So this one's going to be really straightforward and simple to make. This is my favorite method for making quarter square triangles. I've cut 4 strips, 2 blue, and it's hard to see this because you're looking at the back of the fabric, but this is the white, and this one is the frosted pink, our soft pink. Stitch them a 1/4 inch on both sides of the strip. Press them, and now we're just going to cut them in our triangles, and that's going to give us each half of the quarter square triangle. Make sure that you have the light side facing up on both of them, because if you've got a dark side and a light side facing up, the triangles are not going to match. They have to be cut on the same diagonal. Once you get them cut, they're going to be a white and a blue and a pink and a blue, and the blue has got to be on opposite sides for them to fit together and make the quarter square triangle. I'll show you what I mean. You have a diagonal line on your cutting mat. That's a 45-degree angle, and that's exactly what we want to cut. Just line this up so that this is on one straight edge. That corner is right on the diagonal. Grab your cutting ruler, lay it across that diagonal, and one clean cut. I'm going to do the next one as well. You leave this on the mat, pivot the ruler, and cut straight. Pull that apart, just set that aside. This gives us 2 identical. Now let's bring the pink one over. I've straightened up the edge, by the way. Okay, line that up again, straight edge, this point on the diagonal, ruler straight across. Nice cut. We'll do the next one while we're at it. Okay, that's my pink and blue, that's my white and blue. And when you place them together, the blue are on opposite sides. If I'd cut this with the blue facing up, you would have the 2 blue, these would be 2 blue facing each other, which is not what we need. Okay, so just make sure when you cut them, the light sides are both up. So that little bit of cutting gave me my 4 half square triangle parts. All I need to do is a little press toward the blue. And then once I get them pressed, I'm going to stitch them all together, matching that seam. Once they're stitched, they fit together nicely where those seams all come together. We're going to press them. I'm going to show you this really fun little trick. This is the long edge that we just stitched. Grab that seam in 2 fingers and this seam in 2 fingers and just pull. There's a few stitches. Now don't back stitch these because you want to be able to pull these out slightly. Lay that seam on one side, that seam on the other, and you'll see this nice little pinwheel that spreads all those seams out. Give that a little press, turn it over, and then press straight down. You see these are diagonal, so we want to be careful not to stretch those as we press. That's why you just give it a press straight down. There, that's a lot of fun. And now I'm just gonna, after I get them all pressed, I'm gonna trim this. I do trim the quarter square triangles. These have lots of diagonals and seams, and they get a little bit skewed. So the templates in the pattern are just a little bit oversized to give you room to trim. Finished measurement of this is 3 1/4 inches. So the halfway mark is 1 5/8. I'll leave a template in the pattern if that makes it a little easier to trim these down, if you find it easier to trim from a template. If you're using just a regular quilting ruler, find the 45-degree angle and lay it right on top of one of those seams. Measure over 1 5/8 inches, which is right there. That point is right at the 1 5/8 inch mark. Hold it nice and firm and trim the first edge. Now we rotate and we do the same thing on all sides. 1 5/8 right there in the point. You see that bottom edge is going to align with the 1/4 inch right there. And then just trim. As you go around each edge, you have a little bit more reference points to work from. Okay, right on the diagonal, over 1 5/8, just the 1/4 inch, and line it right up with that. Trim that. I'm trimming about, it works out to about 1/8 of an inch on each side. And then on the last one, we've got several reference points. We've got the 45-degree angle. We've got this edge aligns with that 1/4 inch there, and then this one aligns here. This one aligns at the top. And trim that edge. And then we have a perfect 3 1/4 inch half square triangle. My trimming is all done. I have 4 perfectly shaped quarter square triangles ready to piece into my 9-patch Ohio Star. To do that, I only need this center patch, which is 3 1/4 inches, and 4 white patches that are the same size. And this goes in the middle. Make sure when you place these, you get that pink quadrant of the quarter square triangle all facing in. Because if you don't notice that, you'll be picking stitches out. Ask me how I know. You have to pay attention. And we're stitching a 9-patch. So just make sure you keep the 9-patch arranged in the right position, and then begin stitching. And this is not unlike how we did the half square triangles. I always recommend making one prototype block. But once you get that first one done and you're satisfied with the process and the measurements and the cuts, stack them all up and get going with a little assembly line and chain piece them all. And that gets you to done a little bit quicker. Lay these out again, and then I do the same thing with this patch. The top row, I like to let the quarter square triangles lay flat, so I'm going to press these toward the 2 white outside patches. This one's opposite, press toward the center. And then same with the bottom as the top, where we press the white toward the white. Lay them out again, and we're going to stitch these. Now, be careful you don't reverse these and get the white facing in. I'll start with the top row. Line up those seams right there. I like to let these seams, as many as possible, lay flat. So because I've got quarter square triangles here, 2 of them, I'm going to press toward the row that just has one single quarter square triangle. That's my logic. press straight down, and we're ready to add our borders. I've cut 4 edges. These go on either side, and then we have a longer strip that will go top and bottom. Press toward the outside. I like to make these a little bit oversized so I can trim them up just right. I press the 2 outside borders toward the border. And I'm just going to take a moment and trim this up so the block is completely square. And then we're ready to put this quilt top together. This quilt has a modern minimalist look, and it has white sashing between the blocks because I wanted to give it lots of room to be bright and airy. And so we have some sashing to cut, and there's also cornerstones. So I've already cut these square cornerstones for the center. When I cut sashing like this that are long, narrow strips, I do my best to maximize the amount of patches I can get out of the fabric I have. So I'm not going to cut these in long strips because that will waste a lot. Now they're 14.5 inches. I'm going to cut one block that's 14.5 inches, which takes me right here. I cut my sashing in these long strips, and I can do that by just folding it over. I'm going to trim off that selvage over there. Then I cut my sashing. The other benefit to doing it this way, when you cut on the long grain, that fabric is not as stretchy as if you cut cross grain. And that's a nice feature for sashing because it's not going to stretch as much as you stitch it to the edge of the blocks. This quilt has 2 different lengths of sashing because around the outside perimeter of the quilt, I decided not to use those little blue cornerstones. And so the sashing has to be longer around the perimeter. So there's 14.5, and the other one, the other block, I'll probably cut 20. I'll leave the cutting layout in the pattern. We're all the way to the outside perimeter, and this quilt is positioned on point, which just means the blocks are diagonal. So the design has this frosted pink triangles around the outside. I need 8 large ones, and I'm showing you my cutting layout just so that you can see how I get the most out of my yard of fabric. Well, it's actually 1.5 yards I'm going to need. My fabric is approximately 42.5 inches wide once I cut the selvages off. Half of that is about 21.25, which will give me my 15 inches on the diagonal. I'm cutting 21.5 full length, full width of fabric. All right, be brave. 21.5 this way. Now I'm going to make sure I have 21.5 this way because I want a square. It goes into my selvage a little bit, but it'll be okay. So I am going to fold it this way so I can trim it. I'll leave this diagram in the pattern for you. I want 21.5 here. There. Now, that gives me a piece of fabric that's 21.5 this way and 43 this way. And then I find the halfway mark. I'm going to have 2 big squares. I've got a piece of fabric that's 21.5 by 43, and half of 43 is 21.5. So now I'm going to cut right down the center, which will give me 2 squares, 21.5 each. There. These are 2 squares that are 21.5 by 21.5. And I'm going to cut each one of them on the diagonals both ways. So this way and this way. And that's going to give me 8 triangles for my outside perimeter. I want to do it that way because I want the straight of grain on the outside so it doesn't stretch. With the diagonal, it could stretch around the perimeter of my quilt and get out of shape, so that would be harder to manage. With the diagonal here, I'm going to stitch that onto the straight grain of the sashing, and that will stabilize this diagonal, which is much stretchier. Let me do these one at a time. Now I want to cut down there and this way. Maybe I'll fold it like this. I've folded it 2 ways. That's my outside edge. These are my inside edge. I need to cut them here and here. I'm going to crease it. And then I'm going to cut right on that crease. And I'm just going to make sure that's got my 15 inches. It does. And then I'm going to lay these two together and cut again. Line them up perfectly. Fold it over. We'll crease again. And that's my other cutting line. And then I just do that to the other square. That gives my 8 outside triangles. Now I still need 4 of the outside corners. For the 4 corners, I need 2 squares that I'm going to cut diagonally, which will give me my 4 corners. I'm just going to line this up. So I still have 4 layers here, so I have twice as much as I need, but I'll save that cut for another project. There, okay. All right, that's another project. And then I cut diagonally. That's my 4 corners. Since that's the outside corner, I have the straight of grain facing out, and the diagonal is facing in, which will be stitched onto the white sash. All right, let's lay out the inside of this quilt. We're stitching this together in diagonal rows. Start with the pink corner, sew this sash on, just center the 2, then stitch this row. So it's the pink, the sash, the bear paw, the sash, and the pink. And then you can stitch the corner, the sashing, and this row together. Next you work on the sash row. So it's a long piece of sashing, cornerstone, sash, cornerstone, sash. And then you just continue a row of blocks, row of sash, until you get all the way to the other corner of the quilt. When I make an on-point quilt, I like to cut the pieces around the outside so that they're a little bit oversized, because it's really hard to get them perfectly the right size around the edge. So what I have to do is just trim it. And what I'm making sure is I've got 1/4 of an inch past here, because that's where my border is going to get stitched onto it. This one needs to be trimmed a bit. That one's a little bit off square. Now I can make sure I've got this lined up right by aligning that 45 degrees with the sash, and then make sure you got 1/4 of an inch here. And I'll start here. I'll line up my 45 degrees, make sure I've got at least 1/4 of an inch. And I just need to do that all the way around the perimeter of the quilt. And then I'll be ready to put this border on. And my first border's all ready. I already have it cut and prepared, and I like to do a diagonal splice. I've added the 2 outside borders. The first one floral, the second one gray-blue. And that's how you bring Driftwood Lane to life. The bright sashing creates a background glow that really lets those classic blocks stand out. If you're drawn to modern quilting but you're not ready to leave traditional design behind, modern traditional quilting offers a comfortable bridge between the two. If you enjoyed this video, Please like and subscribe for more modern traditional quilts. I'm Valerie Dawn from Quilt with Val, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy quilting!